Welcome, everyone. My name is Jason Oliver Chang, and I am professor of history and Asian American studies at the University of Connecticut. I'm also director of the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute, and we will be we put together this event in collaboration with our partners at ECSU and their big read this year, which is Thi Bui's wonderful The Best We Could Do. And what the core part of this partnership is a school extension program where we want to bring resources and materials and training to introduce Asian American studies into Connecticut schools. For the last, since starting in January, we started a grassroots movement in Connecticut to advocate for the inclusion of Asian American and Pacific Islander studies. And we've succeeded in getting language in past this session. And so we now have a mandate for the state to create a K-8 model curriculum. And we have 3 years to build that, but we're going to get started on that now. And we're really excited about the partnership between ECSU and Make Us Visible CT, which pushed for this legislation. And we really see this as an opportunity to kind of build homegrown Asian American studies. We want that to be here representing our communities and in our schools. So before we get started, let me, okay, can everyone see that okay? Oh, great, all right. So I wanna start our event today, this afternoon, with a land acknowledgement. So, I want to, here in Connecticut, we live on the indigenous territories of the Mohegan, the Mashantucket Pequot, the Eastern Pequot, the Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pagusset, Wangunk, and Nipmuc peoples. European settlers occupied this land by force and enriched themselves through the dispossession of indigenous peoples through land expropriation and genocide, as well as the enslavement of American Indians and Africans. It is also significant to recognize that through settlement, colonials cleared forests to build ocean crossing ships. These vessels fueled the cycle of conquest and imperialism that shaped not only the African slave trade, but also the US relationship to the Pacific Islands and Asia, one that is still maintained today. It is upon this acknowledgement of land and historical relations that we seek a more socially just future for all. And this event today, this expert panel and teacher's guide for Thi Bui's The Best We Could Do is made possible by the NEA's Big Reads grant, partners at ECSU and Asian American Pacific Islander New Haven, and our Make Us Visible CT team. I also want to give a shout out, a special thanks to activists in residence, JHD, for their role in coordinating the teacher and school outreach program and for continuing the activists in residence program at the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute. Let's see here. Okay, can y'all see that? Okay, so this is a map representing the distribution of Asian Americans in the state according to the 2017 state census. And one of the things that we find when we look at this is that Vietnamese make up the third largest ethnic group in the state. And Vietnamese Americans are found in every county of Connecticut. And the largest population of Vietnamese Americans in the state is in Hartford County. Not many people would probably know that, but this is also an important recognition for the scope of what Asian American studies in our schools could look like, and that it's really relevant to all schools in the state. So sorry for jumping around in screens. I planned for a much smoother presentation. Their stories and their lives are difficult to find in our public school curriculum. And so our public school extension program, it gives us the chance to create new avenues for generating homegrown Asian American studies in the Connecticut context. And so Thi Bui's award-winning graphic novel, The Best We Could Do, is a wonderful gift that brings to life one family's experience and a window into the variety of experiences within the Vietnamese refugee diaspora. I'll show you one other wonderful resource here. So this is, a couple instances of the introduction of the first introduction to the state of Vietnamese refugees in 1975. And here we see the first arrivals and the Hartford Courant reporting on that. Now, this is an experience that has actually become quite common in Connecticut. Several years ago, we welcomed first Syrian refugees, and very shortly we'll be welcoming Afghan refugees to the state. And there's another great graphic novel called Welcome to the New World, a Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times series covered by NPR recently. And it tells the story of the Aldabon family from Syria settled in West Hartford, and really reflects the incredible resources available to us to expand the understanding of the refugee experience in the US, and brings our attention to the present and the upcoming work of welcoming Afghan refugees to our state. And now, now that I've gotten all my, slides out of the way and I've introduced myself and the project, the real prize for this webinar are our participants, our expert panel. So I want to thank Kate Capshaw from UConn, Nu-Anh Tran, so from my colleague at UConn, Quan, Tran, and Ivan Small. Thank you guys so much for participating in this. We're so lucky to have your expertise represented in this, and I'm really looking forward to learning from you. And with that, I want to kick it off with JHD. The floor is yours, and I am out of your way.
Thanks, Jason. I think my my Wi-Fi might not be great at this exact moment, so maybe you're not seeing my video anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Sorry about that. I'm gonna try to move and fix that. But yes, let's get started, because we have limited time with this amazing group of folks who have so much information and so many resources to share with us to make reading this amazing graphic novel even more of an amazing experience with students. So the first question that I have for our panelists is one that I want to direct to all of them. And it's, what research experience do you bring to the study of The Best We Could Do? And feel free at this time to also share a brief overview of your one-pager. If you want to even pull it up on the screen as a screen share, please do. And I'm going to start with Nu-Anh with this question.
Hi, my name is Nu-Anh Tran. Can you hear? I hope you can hear me. I am a historian of Vietnam, and my research is on the Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam, the anti-communist government that was based in Saigon and backed by the United States during the Vietnam War. This is also the regime under which the author Thi Bui's parents spent their adult years. And I made two handouts. One was a basic historical timeline of the for the book. It lays out the basic events and the dates. The other resource I put together was a handout that gives a little bit more of historical context. And so the theme I focused on was the family's survival, and I tried to think about what enabled the family to survive. So I have in bullet points how the family's fortunes compared to other Vietnamese at the time. Sorry, I guess I should have been sharing my screen. So that's
No,
the first
okay. I got you
timeline.
back.
So that's the first timeline. It's a very straightforward historical chronology. And the second handout provides historical context to give you the sense of these people, this family survived, but how many people perished during that particular time period or during that particular event?
Thanks. I'm gonna, I want to just read the whole thing, but I'm gonna move us along. If Ivan, if you wouldn't mind going next.
So hi, everybody. My name is Ivan Small. I'm an anthropologist at Central Connecticut State University. I'll just perhaps share the study guide I put together. Let's see. And so, we'll be talking about this in the course of our conversation today, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but the kind of emphasis that I want to bring to our reading of Thi Bui's novel is the aspect of transnationalism and the kind of significance of return migration as Thi Bui begins to understand her broader family history. Talking about the research experience that brought me to this kind of work, I've been working in Southeast Asia and more specifically Vietnam for a number of years now. And for me, the journey began as a very personal one. I grew up in a mixed race household in New Jersey. My mother is Vietnamese. I had a Vietnamese grandmother who came to the States as a refugee in 1981, who lived in my household. She didn't speak English. And, so I kind of grew up with an awareness of Vietnam, although not necessarily a strong interest in the place, in part because I couldn't travel there. Like Thi Bui, Vietnam was always a specter in my life, but not something that I actually started to engage with until when I was in college in the mid-1990s. I had the chance to go to Vietnam for the first time. Things were starting to open up. On that trip, I met my grandfather for the first and only time. And it really kind of reoriented my interests to Vietnam in a way that I didn't know exactly how it was going to play out. But over the next few years, I started to, I first backpacked to Vietnam and I traveled there. And then I started to read the kind of, relatively narrow canon of English language books about Vietnam and Vietnam's history and culture that was available in the 1990s. This led me to kind of a turning point where I decided I want to pursue this professionally. So again, the kind of personal lead to the professional. In 2003, I had the chance to travel to Vietnam again, this time with my grandmother. And for her, the first time that she was returning to Vietnam since 1981, when she left as a refugee. And one thing that I emphasize in my notes is that, and that really comes out in this book, is that the kind of refugee subject position is always an involuntary one. People like my grandmother left Vietnam because they had to, not because they necessarily wanted to. And for many years in New Jersey, she was not very happy living there. She always said she wanted to go back to Vietnam. And so by 2003, things were starting to change in the country. It was economically better off. And so our family talked about the possibility of her returning there and reconnecting with her extended family network there. So I was tasked with taking her back to Vietnam in 2003. And this coincided with my interest in pursuing a PhD. And so I started to look around for topics that I might want to study related to Vietnam. And, by coincidence, these kind of came together as I took my grandmother around to meet extended family members. I was also tasked with giving them money. There was a way of kind of helping, those families support my grandmother as she was staying with them, but also gifts from my mother, who had not been back to Vietnam in many years. And I started to realize that this practice of remittances, which is what I eventually ended up focusing on as a scholar, and something that economists are very interested in. Remittances are defined as monies that are sent back by migrants to home communities. Well, I realized that these were important not only economically, but socially. Every time I gave out money to family members, I started to hear stories. I started to see, that these played a very important role in kind of reestablishing kinship connections, but they also were very complicated. As you were giving out different money to different people, and all kinds of stories came out in the process. And so I eventually chose to research that. I came back to Vietnam in 2007, and I spent about 2 years there researching the social effects of remittances, interviewing households that had received remittances from overseas relatives, including the United States, but also other places where the diaspora has relocated, including Germany and France and Australia. That kind of really kind of elucidated these transnational connections that continue for many Vietnamese families that are now global. At the end of my time in Vietnam, I returned to the States and I went to California, and I spent about half a year in California in total, spread over a couple of summers, talking to Vietnamese Americans who had built communities in San Jose and Orange County. These are the two of the largest Vietnamese communities in the United States today. In order to understand the other side of the remittance relationship, I wrote a dissertation eventually about this research. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I want to make sure we have enough time to get to the other parts. Okay. Why don't we pause there, and we could circle back to those stories in a bit. Sure. But let's come back to this round. All right.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, we're definitely gonna come back to you. Kate, how about you? Would you be willing to share now?
Sure. Thank you. Hi, I'm Kate, and I just want to thank Jenny and Jason for organizing this incredible event in celebration of this book that I think is so teachable for high school classrooms, and I'm really excited to talk about it. I'm a professor of English and affiliate faculty in Africana Studies, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and American Studies at UConn. And my teaching investments are in the graphic novel, and I also teach young adult literature to future teachers. And so I'm really excited to talk with you. My research in the graphic novel contends largely with novels that are taught in classrooms, like John Lewis's March. I have some work on John Lewis coming out soon. And my one pager focuses on hopefully a set of questions that you might be able to bring into your own classrooms when you're introducing this novel to students. And they have to do largely with the position of childhood and how a child narrator or a child focal character permits a kind of refreshed attention to history and to trauma and to the importance of family story. And so there are real advantages, I think, and we see this in lots of landmark graphic novels, such as Art Spiegelman's Mouse or Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis, that a child's at the center of a narrative about historical memory, about trauma, can really afford a lot of advantages. And so what I aim to do with that sheet was just to sort of offer some questions that you might be able to use in a classroom around Thi as a central character who kind of moves across ages. So thank you.
And last but not least, Quan, would you also be willing to share?
Sure. So thank you, Jason and Jenny, for organizing this. And it's really nice to be on this panel with all of you. And hello to all of you who are tuning in, but we can't see you. Yeah, so my name is Quan Tran, and I am currently a senior lecturer at Yale University in the Ethnicity, Race, and Migration program. I come to the topic of my research, which is about the Vietnamese diaspora writ large. And one of my focus is on the Vietnamese boat people exodus, right, which is the experience that Thi Bui's family underwent. And just for me, this is both an intellectual endeavor, but also a personal endeavor. Like Ivan, I was born in Vietnam, came to the US at 12, and really was very, very, very confused as to why I had to leave Vietnam, because I was born in the post-war context. And I had thought that America was just a bad place, and I didn't understand why we had to go. And then I realized that there are so many other Vietnamese living outside of Vietnam, and that really prodded my interest and curiosity about trying to understand these various historical formations. And that brought me to just thinking about the boat people exodus as a way into thinking about history, but also history and memory. I'm interested in, why was there a period where over 1 million Vietnamese boat people left the country, but also in terms of how this particular mass migration is being remembered, right, in the various places that Vietnamese refugees have resettled in. And I just have a really quick screen share just so that we can kind of get a sense of the scope of this particular exodus. Can you all see my slide? Okay, yeah, so the exodus, right, happened between the late 1975 through 1992. It could stretch longer to 1997, depending on how you want to define the closure and the end of the exodus. And as you can recall in the Best We Could Do, Vietnamese refugees were leaving from mostly South Vietnam, but also from North Vietnam to find refuge in various countries in Southeast Asia, but also in Hong Kong. And they found refuge in some of these refugee camps that are scattered across. So the thing that's circled in red is Marang, which was the refugee camp that Thi Bui's family stayed in. And thereafter, they were able to get resettled. So that number that you can see, just quick, overview is just how long stretched out this particular exodus was. And it has its peak particularly in 1979. And there were several historical developments that kind of led to the ups and downs. And I'm happy to go into that in details, maybe in the Q&A if we have time. But I just wanted to point out, right, Thi Bui's chronology of the exodus started in 1978, which was here. And at that time, her family was one of 86,000 something people who had left the country that survived. The number of the people who had died is very difficult to ascertain precisely. And there has been estimates of anywhere between 200,000 to as high as 500,000. But again, that is a number that historians are having a difficulty in terms of pinpointing down. Because, right, the records only come from those who survived the trips, not those who perished, and sometimes there are boats that perished. And because of these large number in refugee camps, Vietnamese then were picked up to be resettled across the world, right? And so this map just kind of give you a sense of where the Vietnamese people were then scattered from this particular exodus alone, and how wide flung that is. And because of that, I became so much interested in how these memories are being kept and being proliferated in the diaspora and why they are being addressed, right? So some of the things that I do is I look at memorials that refugees have built across the diaspora. So here are some images of that. I also look, conducted oral history interviews, but also analyze other oral history interviews that were conducted by others. Particularly interviews that were coming out from the Vietnamese in the Diaspora Digital Archive and the Viet Stories archive at UCI. I also look at memoirs, and it happens that The Best We Could Do is one of the memoirs that I look at. I look at art, and I look at the ways in which, right, musical and other forms of cultural production also holds the vessel for memory of this particular exodus. And so because of that, for this conversation, I'm very keen on having folks think about how in The Best We Could Do, oral history is a form and a method to recover history that of displacement, of ruptures, and of mass migration. And for the page that I contributed to the conversation is about how to incorporate oral history in this context. So, thank you.
So now the audience can see just a little bit of what our panelists have to offer. We're going to go to another round of questions. This one I'm just going to direct to a couple of our panelists. I'll start with Ivan. The question is, what do you think is most important to understand about teaching The Best We Can Do in the context of Connecticut?
So yeah, so this is a story that's takes place in California, and a lot of the narratives about the Vietnamese diaspora do take place in California. But in some ways, California is not that different from Connecticut. It's a suburban state. It's a diverse state, and often recognized as more diverse because it incorporates cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles. But when we think about Connecticut, and connected to the broader, northeastern area, it's a state that's very much shaped by, nearby cities, New York and Boston, and flows of people from those cities into Connecticut. And so there's a lot of economic and ethnic demographics in Connecticut that can differ quite a bit from one town to another. It often goes underappreciated because we do not incorporate those big cities. So we don't have, big showcase places like, Chinatowns in New York cities that people think of. And so, there's this kind of, Connecticut, often people think of it as a very kind of white state. The motto is Connecticut always still revolutionary, and there's a lot of that emphasis on Revolutionary War histories. But it's important to showcase the diversity that does exist here. And some of its evidence is often in tucked away places, such as Korean and Vietnamese markets and nail salons found off strip highways and shopping malls in places like East Hartford, Indian motels and restaurants scattered along the Berlin Turnpike, Burmese refugees who have recently come into places like Hartford and are working behind sushi counters in places like Whole Foods. So, there's a long history of refugees in the state, and they've been resettled into diverse urban and suburban areas by resettlement agencies such as Catholic Charities or IRIS. Last I checked, Hartford has actually the 5th largest Vietnamese population on the East Coast. And, it's beaten out only by much larger cities like Philadelphia. So that's pretty significant and often goes underappreciated in the state. So, Asian Americans make up about a little less than 5% of the population, but it is the fastest growing population in Connecticut. And that's significant for a state that's often seen as having a kind of stagnant population growth. And so Connecticut, teaching about Connecticut histories and communities have to include all of these different groups' histories. It's also a state, as Jason mentioned, that's resettling a new group of refugees that are coming from Afghanistan. And those community stories will also eventually be shared, and there will be a hankering by the second generation to understand those journeys that their parents took. And so, it's important in the classroom to be able to cultivate a young generation that is interested and aware of the kind of multicultural tapestry that Connecticut has. And so I think, in particular, there's an important of emphasizing what the refugee subject position is. Refugees by nature are people who came involuntarily to a place, and so especially among the first generation, there's a transnational orientation. Southeast Asians who came to the United States in the 1970s, 1980s, often hoped and believed that they would eventually return to Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. And so that kind of first generation, those are stories that we have to incorporate and we have to include. And oftentimes if you have a narrative that does not include that kind of transnational imaginary that starts in places of origin and countries of origin, you exclude that first generation. You exclude their narratives that they are also actively writing, but oftentimes in their languages as opposed to English. And so there's an important case to be made for kind of engaging with places of origins, and wherever that be it Vietnam, whether it be Ireland, and for Thi Bui, she talks about her trip to Vietnam, and that's significant for her. It's an ambivalent one, but it allows her to see the place that Vietnam has become, to meet people who live there now. It enables her to move forward with her own identity and make connections with her family and understand her family narratives. And so I think, kind of celebrating that connection in the classroom, encouraging students to tell these stories is important. Oftentimes students are discouraged from exploring those transnational elements. And this goes back to, a long history of Asian Americans being discouraged from talking about orientations to other places. Japanese Americans, for example, were interned during World War II because they were seen as not being loyal to the United States, and that led to a whole generation of Japanese Americans in the 1950s not continuing linkages, cultural linkages, and language linkages, and we have to change that. So I think again, this kind of transnational element that Thi Bui's novel allows us to catch a glimpse of is important and something that we can teach in the classrooms.
Thanks so much. Quan, would you like to also comment on that question?
Sure. Yeah, Ivan just kind of really made the case, right, for why this is significant. And the other thing I just wanted to add to the conversation is that, in teaching this text in Connecticut, particularly to high school students, that probably means that, some of the students in the classroom that this book might be taught have family members who have directly experienced, right, all of the events that Thi Bui story kind of chronologized for us. And because of the traumas that many Vietnamese refugees have faced, and that is a multi-generational trauma, that they may not have talked about that even within their own household, right? So the silence that Bui talks about that kind of haunted her family might resonate with the various students who might be reading this text and could identify with this particular history. So I think the book could be a very powerful invitation to spark those kinds of conversations, right? And help the younger generation understand the complex histories of modern Vietnam, the Vietnam War, as well as the family's migration stories. But I also think that, because the text, right, deals with refugee experiences, and as it's already been alluded to earlier, this is a text that could resonate with non-Vietnamese who come from refugee or immigrant backgrounds, right? Because some of the experiences of adjusting to Connecticut, to life in the U.S., and whether in Chicago, California, or Connecticut, can be quite similar in some ways, right? And then here in Connecticut, particularly, right, in the recent decade, we've seen, as Ivan and Jason had mentioned, Afghan refugees, Burmese refugees, but also Iraqi, right, Syrian refugees, Sudanese, and Congolese. So the text, I think can have an impact really beyond the Vietnamese experience, right? And the complexity that this text also kind of remind us is that the presence of refugees, of some refugee groups and some immigrant groups in the United States is in part because of US foreign policies, right, abroad, and kind of military involvement. And we're currently seeing that being kind of repeated with the story of the Iraqis and the Afghan refugees. And so how do we think about, right, the story of refugee as not just people who somehow got displaced randomly and needed to be rescued, but actually prod a little bit further and ask, what are the historical conditions that led to their displacement, and what are the questions about accountability, right? And in the context of Connecticut, we could also see that this is, if refugees' presence in the U.S. is part of, in part, right, not all, not fully, but in part of US ventures abroad, then those who have family members who served in US military could actually be another set of audience for this book. Because, right, their parents or grandparents or even great-grandparents participated in some of these wars abroad. And so how might this story and the complexity that it offers actually ask us to ask a deeper question about how wars, how migrations are being experienced by multiple sets of actors. So I think those are some of the things that would be important to keep in mind for the Connecticut context.
Thank you so much to both of you. I'm going to turn this to a different question now, specifically about your favorite portions of the text and why they were significant to you. And I want to start with Nu-Anh with this question.
So my favorite portion of the text takes place briefly in chapter 4. It is the portrayal of Thi Bui's father's native village in northern Vietnam, Loi Dong village, and that section portrays how the village was caught between the French on the one side and the communists on the other during the First Indochina War. For me as a historian, this section is very interesting because there are actually very few depictions in English about the First Indochina War from the Vietnamese perspective. And for many Americans, they think of wars in Vietnam as beginning with the American intervention. And so what this section is it's a reminder that this is a dynamic that existed during the Vietnam War, but it predates the Vietnam War. It's about rural people being stuck between a superpower or much more powerful Western forces and native forces that are less powerful, but often know the terrain and know the village much better. And in many ways, you see the choices that the villagers make. It's not always about ideology. In some ways, it's just about survival. And so for me, that was just really great to have a depiction of that. And another thing that I think that makes it special actually is it's the only moment in the book that is about rural people during a war in Vietnam. And it's actually rural people that bore the brunt of the violence during both the First Indochina War and the Vietnam War. And that's the only the moment in the book where we get that. And it's also the moment in the book that explains the author's father's trauma or the author's father's sort of personality later on. And so you can also understand he's the only one who seems to have experienced this, the most extreme experience of violence during the wars. And he's also the one that has for whom that has to live with that consequence in a way that her mother doesn't.
Thank you, Kate. I'd love to hear same question from you.
Thanks. Actually, my favorite section of the novel really works well with what Nu-Anh just put forth, because I'm really interested in the sections that focus on silence and sort of the erasure of historical trauma, and yet its presence literally in the air. And so I like when Thi is a child in California and living in the apartment complex, and the scenes that really reflect on her powerlessness over knowing what is this oppression, what is this history that's around her. And so I have an image, because I think we have to just acknowledge that Thi Bui is a genius artist, and there are so many spectacular panels that you could look at in this book, so many really innovative panels, but I selected one that appears on the surface to be sort of a quiet panel so that we can kind of look through the ways in which the storytelling happens. And so I'm gonna see if I can share my screen. I'm really excited to share this with you, and I hope that it works. Unfortunately, the Zoom thing is covering up these fancy animations that I created where everything sort of pops up. So I'm sorry, I can't do that because I can't see how that's gonna work. But anyway, this is page 71. They're in the apartment. And the title of this chapter 3, is called Home, the Holding Pen. And if you look through the first sections of the chapter, there's lots of linearity in the images. There's lots of sort of images of confinement and sort of crisscrossing where Thi is trying to find herself sort of on a map and in this space. And it is really about that repression that she feels. And so just sort of walking through the panels that you see here, you notice that every panel that's created is consciously constructed with a sense of meaning. And so if a panel is the full page, it's more immersive. If the panel is small and regular, then we get a sense of time proceeding in a kind of regularized sense. And here you really do sense the regularity of the time in this space and the confinement that she is trying to convey in the apartment. Even in that second panel, when her sisters go to school, you can see that they are confined in a box. They're in a rectangular box as they're kind of heading towards school, which is, I think, pretty fabulous. And then you can also notice the wait of the two children are waiting for their mom to come home from work, and they're being raised by their father during the day. And the pacing just emphasizes this kind of sluggishness of time, and the text boxes on the top really, they fall across the sequence of the images. They get heavier and heavier and heavier until they're at the bottom in that penultimate panel, which I think is really quite fantastic. And then in the third panel, we get like sort of a cinematic view from a distance of the children looking at TV. Then it moves into the children, they're separated from each other in their own panels. The clock appears, which again sort of iterates the waiting for the mom and waiting for the sisters to come home. The child turns, Thi turns to look to her father, and her father's looking the other way, looking off the page and away from her. But what breaks up the kind of plotting time, the predictability of this confined home space is the smoke. And if you look through this chapter, the images of her father's cigarette smoke whirling around her, swirling around her, it conveys to me the presence of this memory, that this pain and the trauma that she can't quantify, that she can't get to. But here in this sequence, it really just bursts through the panels. And interestingly, if you think about graphic novels and the way that we read from left to right, and so narratives sort of progress in that way, it's pointing backwards. The smoke is heading backwards into the past, like the memory, and it's uncontainable from the panels sequence. And I love this section. And it is just one, I just sort of randomly said, oh, I like the smoke. And I paid attention to what was going on in the images. And it's really quite stunning. And so I would encourage you as teachers, if you just sort of think through how the panels are arranged on the page and the repetition of particular images and how they evoke, for me, the smoke really evokes memory, trauma, but also rivers and sort of the swimming that's also a theme visually across the text too. It's all about memory and the inability of Thi to access the pain that is swirling literally around her. So that's my favorite section, and I picked a quiet sequence, even though it's all spectacular.
Great. I'm going to move to the next question, but I'm hoping to ask the same question to the other panelists that we didn't get to hear from. All right, this is going to be a quick round because we also need to come back to what Ivan was sharing at the beginning. So this is a question for all the panelists. Would love to hear from you. If you could identify one thing that you want teachers to walk away from this panel with as they bring this text to the classroom, what would you highlight? And I'm going to start with Quan this time.
Okay, sure. For takeaway points, I think I'd love for teachers and students to understand that refugees, right, are not simply passive victims of historical events. And I think this book really demonstrates that they are active actors who must face and make difficult choices to navigate, negotiate, and survive, forces that are beyond their control. But the challenges that they manage to overcome are, on the one hand, a testament to their strength and resilience. And then on the other hand, right, these challenges will mark multiple generations. And the legacy of ruptures and displacement is long lasting. And it is an act of having to revisit in order to move on, and then having to revisit again. So the text does a great deal of that kind of memory work and invite others to do so.
Same question for Ivan. One takeaway.
So, again, I think the kind of transnational perspective that I've been talking about, and, I think in answering that question, I want to reference a passage that also resonated with me on page 36. Thi Bui reflects on her own reasons to take a return journey to Vietnam. And she says that she wanted to see Vietnam as a real place and not as a symbol of something lost. And it shows the importance of so-called homelands and places of origin as important in American identity constructions. And so, how do we incorporate transnational narratives for our students? Well, for many immigrant communities, and perhaps especially in refugee communities, stories about origins and journeys are important, even though they may be left unspoken in many cases. And so younger children in the second generation, some of whom, many of the audience will be teaching, are often curious to know these histories, to learn about these stories, but maybe reluctant or sometimes even embarrassed to explore them. And so again, I think it's great that we're kind of bringing this into, into the classroom at an early age. I teach at CCSU, and many students get very excited about the transnational connections that, that their families have, whether it be, in Jamaica or India, and they want to tell those stories, and oftentimes they haven't had a chance to. And myself growing up in New Jersey, I was never encouraged to do that. And so it's only in college, only in grad school that you start to explore those. So I think highlighting transnational connections and origins should be encouraged and celebrated in classrooms, whether, wherever you come from. And I think it's important to encourage creative ways to express and explore these journeys into diverse identities. And this novel provides an example of a non-traditional and non-linear form of expression. This means that, these non-linear forms of expression don't necessarily celebrate America and American identity as an arrival point, whatever that means. And I think that that's important. So, the graphic novel, I think, is an interesting form where you can kind of engage complex ideas about transnationalism. I was going to mention, in my earlier introduction, that I eventually wrote a book about transnational relationships between Vietnamese Americans in California and Vietnam. And I had a whole chapter about return migration. So, relevant to what Thi Bui is talking about. But of course, this graphic novel is much more accessible and much more relatable for a young audience. And I think that's a way of kind of drawing people into a conversation that many people want to have.
Kate, what's your takeaway that you want people to walk away with?
Sure. So to sort of spin off what Ivan was suggesting about the graphic novel form, all forms of art are artificial, but what's I think stunning about graphic novels is that they draw attention to the artifice in ways that other forms don't. And so we all know we're looking at a cartoon, right? But we're also looking at a really human story. And that artifice, the way that it conspicuously brings out boxes of time and sets them side by side, affords an access to history and to story that conventional prose narratives, it's a lot harder to execute. So you can set a moment in Vietnam next to a moment in America and draw a lot of really fantastic and complex results interpretively as a reader and as a student. So for teachers, I would just encourage them to think about how the form and the content work really well together, to jump back and forth across, as Ivan was saying, transnationally, across time, across family histories, drawing equivalencies that are really interesting in terms of the size of the figures on the page, and really iterating what trauma feels like, because we know that trauma is fractured, and we know that narrative is sometimes a way to sort of put those pieces together. And we see that process come together on the page of a graphic novel in I think really compelling ways, because the past is literally present on the page with the present tense. And so that's kind of what I would draw teachers' attention to, thinking about that affinity of form and content, and talking about the construction of historical memory, because history is constructed. And on the page in a graphic novel, you can really see it happen. And then you can see a way in which students can sort of take control of their own histories and create their own stories and weave them into national histories as well. It's an exciting, and I think intellectually rich pursuit to study graphic novels in the high school classrooms.
And last but not least, Nu-Anh, what's the takeaway?
Okay, so I am going to try to be concise because I have two takeaways. But first, I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see the what I've just shared? So like I said earlier, I put together two timelines or two handouts. This is the historical timeline. So one of the takeaways I think that I like teachers to take away from this panel is that the author Thi Bui intentionally challenges conventional American understanding of the Vietnam War. And I would say she does so in at least two ways. So our popular understanding of the war in the US is really about the American experience. So obviously the author challenges that by writing about her family's experience of the war from a Vietnamese perspective, and specifically from a Vietnamese refugee perspective. I would say there's another way in which she challenges it too. In the US, most research on the Vietnam War is about diplomatic history and military history, what we kind of think of as history with a capital H. And so I put together this timeline so that if teachers want or if students want, they can identify particular historical events that take place in the memoir. But at the same time, you can also use this timeline to think about how the author challenges the sort of conventional understanding. So while the conventional, so most of the research is on diplomatic and military history, the memoir is about a particular family. And in focusing on a family, the memoir is actually bring to light a different type of history, social history, the history of the lives of ordinary people. Many students tend to think of history as only about dead kings and presidents. They don't realize there's an entire field of history called social history. So one of the things I think you can do with this timeline is both use it to identify events in the memoir, and at the same time, to use it to think about how the author challenges the type of history that's represented by this timeline, in that she doesn't follow a historical chronology, she follows the life of her family, and it flashes back and forth between present and past, and it doesn't even move through the past chronologically, it moves through the past thematically. The second handout I put together, and can you see this one? You should be able to see a handout that says Surviving History. So the other, great. So the other takeaway that I would want teachers to take away from this panel is to think about how the memoir relates to the historical context. So this memoir and many Vietnamese refugee accounts emphasize the suffering of Vietnamese refugees, and understandably so. But when you place this memoir within the larger historical context, what you find is that refugee families like Thi Bui's family were actually really lucky in many ways. So in this particular case, Thi Bui's family was relatively privileged. The author, and I sort of lay out the different ways in which the author's family was lucky. So both her parents come from rather privileged backgrounds. In South Vietnam, only a fraction of the population completed high school, let alone university. Both her parents completed university. Her father was able to not be drafted during the war by becoming a school teacher. This was not an option available to poor, uneducated men. And then after the war, her mother had the gold to purchase or had the money to purchase a place for her family on the boat to leave Vietnam. This is not an option open to people who didn't have the money. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is not to say that this family suffering was any less real or not bad. It certainly was. But what I do want people to get from this is that the family's relative privilege probably helped them weather successive wars and revolution and the very difficult post-war period. So that refugees are survivors, they're often very lucky survivors, and that luck often has to do with a somewhat or fairly privileged background. And I say that as a refugee myself, so I want to make clear that I'm not somehow suggesting that her family didn't suffer, but that suffering and context helps us understand how the family survived. And those are my two takeaways, and I will stop sharing screen now.
Thank you all so much. I want to, at this point, come back to what you were talking about at the beginning, Ivan, in response to the first question about your research experience. Give you a little bit more time for that, and then we'll move into a Q&A period.
Why don't we just move into the Q&A? I mean, I was just getting to the point where, I was talking about the research that I conducted, in Vietnam and California, and how that led me to, to a book that, deals with return migration, as I mentioned. So Thi Bui's, discussion of, the significance of her travel back to Vietnam, and, there's large numbers of Vietnamese Americans and Vietnamese from other countries in the diaspora that are traveling back to Vietnam these days, and the government has facilitated that in various ways. Both people of the first generation who perhaps finally have the opportunity to return to where they always wanted to be, but also people of the 1.5 and second generation who have found opportunities there, and identity explorations are may often be a starting point for that. So again, the book that I wrote, not accessible for high school students necessarily, but I think a graphic novel allows us for students to engage with these stories visually and to connect it to their own, and perhaps that leads to a longer term interest in exploring these issues. So.
All right, thank you all so much. Thank you, Ivan, Kate, Nu-Anh, Quan. So much appreciation, and wish that we could stay on for a lot longer to hear more about the many things that you can offer our teachers in their preparations for their work with their students. So we're moving into a Q&A period now. And Jason, I might be wrong, but my understanding is that people in the audience can come off mute to ask their questions. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm working on that setting right now.
Yeah, I think we're a small enough group that it would be great if folks just came off mute and shared their questions that way. If you don't have questions or you're still marinating on what you might want to ask, I have some questions because I want to go back to some of the panelists with some of the questions that we had that they didn't get to answer yet. But if folks have questions, please come off mute and ask them.
While we're waiting for folks to ask questions, I also just want to say that this is actually a very helpful conversation for all of us on this panel too, because as I understand it, we're all teaching Thi Bui's graphic novel in some way in our own classes. So it's really helpful to kind of get these different perspectives that we're bringing to the conversation here. Catherine, I loved your discussion of the aesthetic, that smoke that's going backwards. I didn't even notice that, but I think these are all kind of different ideas that we can bring into our into our teaching when we eventually do introduce this into the classroom. So, if we want, we can always talk about how we're thinking about doing this in our own courses. But I know that there's many people here are thinking about this in a secondary school context, and so we can also go that way.
I appreciate what everyone has put forth in terms of the context of the history of refugees in Connecticut in particular, and then also the points about Vietnamese history being much more complex and much more intricate than the American imagination conceives of. And I think that this novel introduces those historical concepts in ways that hopefully a young audience will be able to apprehend. And I'm really interested in perhaps Nu-Anh or Quan or anybody's really perspective on how it depicts history and sort of like the images on the page in terms of how history is rendered. Because I think the visual style really varies depending on the moment that's being offered. So I don't know enough about that history to understand exactly what she's formulating, but that's just a question that I had of everybody, Ivan as well, because obviously you were all so richly informed about the history of Vietnam.
One thing I will say to that question is that what I found very interesting is that the very beginning of the novel, there's that illustrated timeline. And most of the illustrated timeline, it more or less reflects popular images that are widely available. But the rest of the memoir is about her family's, this private history. So it's this juxtaposition between this publicly known, chronological history and this private, little known history of her family that is not chronological. So I thought that was a very interesting juxtaposition. There are also a couple moments in the memoir, sorry, do I call it a novel? The memoir, when she has background images, but if you know the history, you would recognize it, such as the picture of the self-immolation of the monk in the background in 1963, the self-immolation of Tet Quang Duc in protest against Ngo Dinh Diem. But if you don't know that history, you don't know that imagery, you might not recognize it. It might just be background. So one of the interesting things is how she plays with this sort of foreground and background in this private non-chronological history and this public chronological history, and how she switches her artistic style for those two stories, those two narratives.
Yeah, and I just want to add, to the point, right, that one of my favorite lines in the book is actually when she says, because I'm paraphrasing, I do have to quote here, right? She wrote in on page 184, where she writes, lacking memories of my own, I've come to depend on other people's stories, right? And I think that's a moment, I think the memory work that she takes up in this book is trying to really reconcile, right? These multiple histories and these multiple memories that sometimes inform each other and other times contradict each other. And I think that explains, right, the different kind of styles that she takes on to kind of try and separate those, but in many ways, these things bleed together, right? And to Nu-Anh's point earlier, it is not, the way that we think about history, especially in sometimes K through 12 context, it is about the capital H history. But we forget that these capital H histories are part and parcel to all of those other smaller H histories, right? And then we think of history as the kind of fact sort of set in stone, but it's actually a set of memories that are being played out and being privileged as history, right? And so how do we think of engaging with the past and thinking about the past as a kind of fluidity rather than something that is set in stone that can be so easily confined within a particular timeline or a particular kind of period, right? So yeah, I think the book is really ingenious in so many different ways. And I could see its relevance in like different kinds of classes as well, right? Not just in an English class, or, I think history class could be really great. And then the other part is thinking about history as a collective effort rather than, right, as a kind of narrative that is capitalized by either the state or something else bigger, a bigger force, but it is a kind of revision that has to always happen. And that is painstaking, right? And that in itself is a process of displacement. And I thought the text does that really, really well.
On that note, I would also add that something that's very interesting is that the history that's presented at the very beginning of the memoir, it essentially ends in 1975. History ends with the Vietnam War. Everything else that happens to our family afterwards is as if it's not a part of history. The sort of the boat people, that's not history. What happens in America, that's not history. And I think that was also kind of a very, very telling of the way I think that 1.5 generation, so people who are often born in Vietnam but grew up in the United States, tend to think of the past. They tend to think of what their parents went through as history, the things they can't remember as history, but their own personal experiences. Somehow that's not part of history, even though obviously things that happened after 1975 are still part of history, but it's very representative of that the worldview that I think what 1.5 generation people often grow up with.
And you see Thi kind of confronting the presence of that history that she has not wanted to acknowledge as hers when the oxygen canisters blow up underneath her apartment building. I'm kind of obsessed with that apartment building. And she goes and she gets the important documents, and she knows exactly what to do in terms of crisis. And then she reflects on that and says, like this is the legacy. It's sort of, I understand, I can sort of walk through how my parents would react in these moments of crisis, because I've lived it in a way through their experience, even though they haven't fully articulated it. I find that to be a very, really moving sequence in the book, and really telling as to what you're saying about the 1.5 generations, dismissal and kind of burial of the past, but then reckoning with it in these ways that are very intimate and domestic.
Yeah, this is a wonderful conversation. And, I love that, we're pulling from so many different, disciplinary backgrounds and different bodies of knowledge. We have one question from the audience from Professor Sean Higgins. Hello, it's nice to have you here. And he writes, I teach Bui's memoir in Japan to mainly Japanese college level students, Temple University's Japan campus. I teach it in a first-person narrative American studies course, and I focus on empathy building practice. Do any of the panelists have particular aspects of the novel they appreciate as opportunities to practice empathy building?
So for me, one of the passages that resonated, just emotionally was when, where was it? When she's doing, she's talking, Thi Bui is talking with her mother, and there's stories of these other siblings that passed away, and those are buried stories. And I was just really affected by this story about the mother remembers this infant daughter that she had, and she was sick in the hospital. When she came to the hospital to visit her, she gave her this bright smile, and for the mother, she remembers that as like a gift that her daughter always gave to her, so that she could always remember her, after many years afterwards. And that the kind of emotional importance of transmitting that story from one generation to the other is really significant here. Thi Bui learns about a sister that she never knew, right? And there's a point where Thi Bui is like trying to connect to her family, and she talks about her father, being so fearful of her father growing up. He was scary. He was just checked out. And then she says, I needed to understand what made him become the person that he became. And she says part of that was learning the right questions to ask. So I love the whole discussion about history with a capital H and lowercase h. And for me, coming from anthropology, a lot of this is about oral histories, and how do we understand these histories in our family. And so I teach methodology classes and in my department, and one of the things we often start with is oral histories in your family. And so I think this is perhaps an interesting exercise that could be employed in the classroom. How do you have an assignment where your students go home and they ask their parents or grandparents or other extended relatives about questions about their own family histories that perhaps they never heard about before? And how does that itself become a very important process of kind of emotionally connecting and building empathy, as the person who asked the question said, within your own family, and understanding your own family history, that history with a lowercase h.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Hi, Sean. I haven't seen you since a long time, but so glad to see you here. I think for me, the point in the graphic memoir that really highlight this theme of empathy is actually the beginning, right? The birth scene and the kind of pain that the narrator went through that opened up a portal to really ask questions that maybe Thi Bui as a narrator wasn't in a place to ask, right? It's the transition from being into motherhood that sparked some of these really deep soul-searching and conversations that the author attempts to bridge in the different gaps. And I think it has to do with this birth giving, for those of you who have done that. It's a moment of trauma, right? There's this insane pain, insane trauma. But I think some emerging out of that, right, is also a process of creating, and it's also a process of understanding maybe what parents might have gone through that as children we may have been oblivious towards, right? And so moments in the text that really, when the author kind of took a pause and say, my parents were at my age, right? They were refugees. And those are small moments where I think that is the active act of creating connections.
I would say in response to this question, and hi, Sean, how are you? Is that, and I know that John is familiar with many graphic novels, but in graphic novels that are so artificial and conspicuously artificial, oftentimes they'll shift visual registers in order to even further prompt their reader out of a kind of immersive experience or an experience of it being fictive. And so in R. Spiegelman's Mouse, at the end, we have, Prisoner of the Hell Planet, which is about the Holocaust and drawn in a really different style, and a photograph of the lost son. And she just Thi Bui does the same thing at the end when she inserts the photographs from the refugee camp, and it's in those moments where you're drawn out of the cartooning and into the photographic, where the real presence of these individuals looking out into your eyes becomes that moment that calls on empathy and calls on response. Like there's like a theory of photography, the civil contract of photography, that talks about like the demands that the photograph can make on the viewer. And I really feel like when she turns, she's not only like stepping out of cartooning, but she's stepping into this almost confrontational demand for empathy by offering the photographs of people of the family in that context. And it really calls on empathy, I think, really profoundly.
This is not a question from the audience, but one of our attendees made a comment. And since we're on the topic of imagery, the chat says, I think that the image of the female protagonist with the map of Vietnam on her back is very powerful embodiment of the country. I'm wondering if you all want to share more about powerful images, things that stood out. And anyone can go.
For me, one of the imageries that really stood out were the images of what I sort of think of as the water images. There are lots of rivers. There's often the ocean. There's often many images where it's sort of a dreamlike wateriness. The sequences where I think that when Thi Bui is a child and she's in the San Diego apartment and she sort of swims through the darkness. To me, that was really something that was powerful, that seemed to connect the memoir aesthetically, because there were moments where water was a source of joy. For example, when she was at the beach, or when her mother was at the beach, you know, whether her mother at the beach in Vietnam or she and her siblings at the beach at the refugee camp. But then there are also moments where water seems to have been something terrifying, especially the image of her father when he's a child having, I think that moment when he has to hide, like, or when the family is the villagers are having to cross the river. Like, those are also moments where water was a source of fear. And so for me, one of the powerful images was the different ways in which the author used sort of watery images throughout the memoir.
Yeah, and I think that particular image, I think it was on page 36, right? It's actually the same page that I even referenced earlier. It's super powerful in that if you actually pay attention, the map is backward, etched on the back, right? And that is an indication of this is something, right, for this particular body that is carrying that map, that is Vietnam, is something that is etched. The past, right? Looking back to the past is something that is etched in the fiber of this body, in the shading of this particular map. Really, actually, if you squint your eyes, you can kind of see right through, right? Like towards the front, because it's kind of three-dimensional. And it makes me think of like the things that we talk about, the baggages that refugees carry, right? The baggages that those who experience trauma and displacement carry with them. As a kind of lifelong and inscription onto the body and in the psyche. So yeah, thanks for pointing it out. It's really a powerful image.
I had one thing I wanted to contribute to, just the fascinating, guys, this is just such a wonderful dive into this text. I also wanted to reflect on the refugee camp portion. You know, especially in the context of both the kind of the visuality of it, but then also as the last section of the text, we're asked to understand the refugee camp as a kind of bureaucratic space, and to go through the whole book, and then to have the family arrive at the refugee camp, and you know, that entire experience getting boiled down to, you know, whether or not the paperwork lines up, you know, is, I think, you know, as you were saying, Kate, you know, this demand for empathy by showing those you know, those photos on the page, and you know, with the kind of penned profiles of the other sort of anonymous or family members who maybe made it through or didn't make it through. you know, that kind of shuffling of opportunity plus luck plus survival plus, you know, whether or not they could make it out of that camp. And, you know, and so with that kind of the bureaucratic legalization of the refugee, you know, sort of status or category, you know, it strikes me as also having this kind of starchiness in the images that are not really present in some of the other images. And so, you know, I think there's this intention around both the demonstrating you know, trying to reduce the complexity of the experience, but then also having it feel visually more plain, less shading, less three-dimensionality, you know, this kind of like flattening to visually. So just, you know, another moment where I was just struck by the genius of the work.
I just want to add that I think, thanks for bringing up the refugee camp, Jason, because I think, you know, I think our imagination of refugee camp is precisely these kind of far away, makeshift spaces, right? But actually the book really shows us how people who live in it manage to weave their ways through it. And it is a place of reinvention, right? So I think there's a line in the book that Thi said, right? In these camps, people also reinvented themselves. Because of the ruptures, because of the displacement, that in kind of the end road, there is another door opening kind of thing, right? And the reconfiguration of families, the ways in which that people, right, were kind of hustling within the camp in order to get out of there, really showcase the kind of agency that refugees have in these moments, right? And to think of, again, you know, in my research, I look at actually the meaning of refugee camps in the Vietnamese diaspora. And it's not just a place of transit, right? For folks who have gone through that, it is another place that has a lot of meanings, and people come back to it, and they're introducing these geographies and these stories into a much more broader history of Vietnam, right? So taking the history of Vietnam out into the diaspora and returning to these camps and marking them as significant sites of historical events, rather than just as something that people have gone through and then forget all about it.
I think that's a great point, and you know, that just kind of emphasizing that these weren't just places of transit. I mean, you know, these are often written out of the, you know, historical narratives, and a lot of people, when they hear about boat refugees, they don't even understand that, you know, boat refugees meant leaving Vietnam, going to another country like the Philippines or Malaysia, and then waiting there for, you know, third country resettlement. And, you know, people carried on their lives there. There's, you know, this like this image here where, you know, she's talking about how, you know, for children, camp was in many ways a wonderful vacation, no school, they played in the water. I mean, those stories are often, you know, not heard about. And so, but they're significant. And I think, you know, Quan, your research is fascinating in that you're looking at, you're kind of reincorporating the refugee camps into, you know, these memory reconstructions as, you know, people are returning to these places that they once were. And, you know, I think that's also important to emphasize when we try to understand the refugee experience, that refugee camps were places that people were in limbo for a very long period of time, you know, sometimes 6 months, but sometimes 2 years. And that in many cases, people were sent back from refugee camps later on. You know, the closure of refugee camps in 1993 by the UNHCR was basically a process of interviewing people and determining if they were truly political refugees or whether they were economic migrants, and that they were determined to be moving for economic reasons. They were sent back to Vietnam, and that created a lot of trauma. It created a lot of awareness among resettled refugees in places like the U.S. who advocated quite actively against that policy. So you know, I do love that recentering of the refugee camp experience in this novel.
what everyone is saying makes so much great sense to me, and I'm going to go back and read through this section again, because I was very much struck by what Jason was saying about how the visual style changes, and it really does map onto what everyone is saying about the opportunity for agency and for reinventing oneself and for claiming space and pleasure. You know, the vacation scene with the children, the juice boxes that are exchanged and the kids marveling at that. And, you know, it's kind of a truism in graphic novel studies that the more stylized, the more iconographic kind of the image is, the more a reader can step into it. The more stylized it is, like Charlie Brown, for instance, or, you know, like Simpsons characters, the more anybody could be in that space. So it kind of makes a lot of sense to me that the style would retreat a little bit. And so that, you know, this becomes a place of possibility rather than a place that's, you know, tethered to particular, you know, horrific and difficult histories. It's a place of reinvention. I have something else to teach now. Thank you.
Jason, it's 6:30. Can you believe it?
Yes, I can. Only in that I'm again surprised at how fast the time has gone by. Yeah, I want to recognize the attendees. I want to point out the attendance of Julia Wintner, who has been our champion with the NEA grant at ECSU. Thank you so much for the work you've done in supporting this big read at your campus, and also this our public school extension. Thank you to all the teachers who have, after a long week, coming and sitting with us for an hour and change. I hope this has satisfied some curiosity and inspired you to use this text. And you know, our overall plan is to use this as an opportunity, use the fall as an opportunity to build your confidence in awareness of the larger issues encapsulated in this amazing book. And we want to offer a number of different engagements that will support both research on Asian Americans in Connecticut, and particularly Vietnamese Americans, Vietnamese refugees in the state, and their history, to link that and to bring that home with the story. There's also Make Us Visible Connecticut events where we're going to feature Asian American poets from Connecticut, and we're going to continue working with the teachers, with you all, to continue thinking about the text and developing particular lessons and strategies for not only engaging students with this, but then also building an inter-school dialogue, which we hope to bring into effect in the spring. So we're really kind of doing this work in the fall in preparation for a larger kind of pattern of student engagement in the spring. And the last thing I want to mention is we will be having a conversation with Thi Bui on November 9th. And this has been graciously funded by the NEA grant, the Asian American Cultural Center, a number of other partners that are going to make this possible. So we're really looking forward to that, and to link this conversation, which has been so rich and deep and generative. And we're going to have a possibility to continue this with the author. So again, amazing insights from this panel that we're going to carry forward. So I encourage everyone to keep in touch. Find us on Facebook at Make Us Visible CT, or you can also reach out to the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute at UConn, and we will be continuing this kind of curricular development and classroom preparation. Thank you, everyone. Nu-Anh, Quan, Kate, Ivan, JHD. Thank you, guys. This is so incredible.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you
me.
too, Jason.
Yeah,
so
so
much.
thank you. Thank you for the great ideas because I have to teach this book later this semester. So this has been really helpful to me.
Thank you so much, Jason, and to everybody. It's fantastic, fantastic.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. The conversation with Thi Bui is actually November 10th, not the
10th.
9th. Yeah, it's a Wednesday.
November 10th.
No,
Thank you,
we'll
Wednesday.
send a flyer to everybody. Thank you so much. It's
Okay, great. Thank you for that correction.
great.
All right, guys. Okay, that's all for our show. Thank you so much, guys, and everyone have a great evening and a wonderful weekend.
You
Thanks
as
for
well.
sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye, everyone.